Hi, everybody. This is Warren Herman. So, today what we're going to speak about is the accusation made by Eastern Orthodox saints that maintains that Roman Catholic saints are in a form of spiritual delusion. I've made some videos contrasting these things before in the past, but this video will be describing some new ways of looking at this accusation and how it can be refuted. And one of the things I'm going to simply bring up is an instance of this argument, which I read the other day. And it occurred to me in thinking over the article that I had read, which made various accusations against certain Western saints, that in fact, there were simply bad arguments being made, and that these arguments simply did not take into account the actual teachings of the saints that were in question, and instead cited sources that were not authoritative or even probably not even accurate. And so I'm going to describe these things in some detail. For example, this article that I read made certain accusations against for example, even the great saint, Saint Therese of Lisieux. It was alleged that Saint Therese was in a state of pride because she had a desire to pray for priests, pray for sinners, and, become a great saint. It's said that therefore she was proud, and so no one should have ever had this kind of prideful desire to be a great saint. Nevertheless, there is a kind of a blind spot, I think, here in this type of argumentation, not necessarily saying that whoever wrote this article is blind to these things. There is a problem here because in this thing, there is this lack of understanding of Saint Therese's spirituality. Saint Therese's entire spirituality is about her unworthiness, her smallness, her littleness, her weakness. So it cannot be that Saint Therese is proud. It can merely be that in that one sentence, Saint Therese is sharing some of her generous desires, whereas in other places, she's sharing her humble dispositions. It's simply that she didn't say all these things in the same spot. This is an interesting thing that happens as well. In the Orthodox tradition, I've read that one does not even pray for the conversion of others in the same way that one might do in the West. For example, if I'm praying the Jesus prayer for my friend and want him to convert, I don't pray, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on them. I pray, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. It's this great emphasis on humility that characterizes the Orthodox tradition, and is not anything bad in itself. That's very good and admirable. But the problem is when we say that, okay, just because you can pray for others by vicariously praying for yourself in a way, like saying, oh, have mercy on me, because you're including them in that prayer in a way with that intention, because you're so humble that you want to only pray for your own salvation, because you don't want to have this presumption that you're being saved and they're not. Just because that's one way of doing this doesn't mean that that's the only way of doing this. It doesn't mean that's the only way. So very well, the fact that Saint Therese kind of split the disclosures that she made about, okay, I would like to be a great saint, these kind of spiritual, generous goals, and her humble dispositions were described elsewhere, doesn't mean she has to say them all at once, and that she's not good if she can't say it in the exact same type of disposition that an Orthodox person might. So that's kind of one way of looking at this problem. There also were, for example, accusations in this list against people like Saint Francis of Assisi and saints who had stigmata. This was followed by some type of a comment by some type of psychological writer saying that hypnotists or psychotherapists, essentially, can reproduce stigmata through hypnosis, and that this is something that therapists know how to do. I don't know that this is true. If this is true, then let's see people be able to do this. This just seems like an old-fashioned type of thing, similar to false understandings of mass hallucination that could just as easily be applied against phenomena in the Orthodox Church, or whatever. You could have other ways of talking about these things. You can kind of have, if you're going to say that things could be hypnotically engendered, then there could be other things that are hypnotically engendered. It just doesn't seem like a good argument. It doesn't seem valid that this is something that is psychosomatic, that, it's a false type of love for Christ. If you're so focused on Christ, you become hysterical, and then it changes blood flow, and it makes your body, produce the stigmata. Of course, that could actually be some description of the mechanisms whereby the focus of the saints produces stigmata. That could be some type of psychophysiological underpinning of the miraculous occurrence, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this can just be reproduced by hypnosis. I mean, it doesn't, I don't think that's accurate. That seems just like a bad argument. And you'll notice also that they're not citing a church authority. They're not citing a saint. They're just kind of making this argument from this kind of random scientist person who seems old-fashioned. It seems like an old-fashioned scientist, so it seems like not a good way of making an argument. So there is something actually that's very interesting. Seraphim Hamilton, who is Orthodox, was talking about criticisms of the Bible that he had encountered, and they were really messing with his mind for a long time, until he realized that many of the arguments made by the historical critical thinkers were just really bad readings of the text. And I think this is the same thing, unfortunately, here for the Orthodox. When they look at the Western saints in this way, I believe that they are actually just having a bad reading of the text. They're not familiar with how the saints are displaying the virtues that they think they're lacking. They're just not as that familiar with it. Another instance is in their criticism of Saint Teresa of Avila. They say that Saint Teresa of Avila's mysticism was kind of just a dreamy ecstasy, and that they explain this, as a problem like that. And they also then cite William James and saying that her spirituality, according to him, was just kind of her flirtations with God, basically, or they kind of these things, this kind of romance with God. But William James is not on a real authority on Saint Teresa of Avila. He's merely, as far as I can tell, Protestant religious or some kind of religious thinker. He's not. He wrote the Varieties of Religious Experience. He's not a thinker who's an expert on Saint Teresa of Avila in the tradition of Saint Teresa of Avila. He may have written about various mystical experiences, but not. He's not an expert on her writings as far as I can tell, nor should he be cited as an expert when there are Catholic experts on these things. So this is a thing where we have to understand St. Teresa of Avila does not affirm the type of things that they say she affirms. For example, they say that spiritual delusion is all about thinking one is worthy to have consolations and closeness with God. St. Teresa of Avila's method actually says the same thing as that. It says, whenever you have a consolation, make sure you say, oh God, I'm unworthy of this. Thank you that you would have such mercy on me to let me have this feeling, because doesn't deserve this at all. St. Teresa of Avila also explains how you can get demonic consolations. She says you can get consolations from demons. But if you take this method of thanking God and saying you're unworthy, then you don't get harmed by the consolations. So she's deeply aware of these things that the Orthodox are accusing her of not being aware of. So it's simply it sounds like it's, again, a bad reading of the text and making bad arguments rather than understanding the whole thing. For example, there's also criticisms of St. Francis of Assisi, things where he says, like, I've done penance. He asks for plenary indulgences to be given to people who visit the chapel. These are just contrasts. These are just criticisms of the Western way of being spiritual by Easterners. But it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It doesn't mean that it's incorrect. There's a deep problem if we're going to say, hey, he's not holy when, for example, they say he ate meat when he was ill. First of all, there may not have been exactly the same rules, in the West and the East. But he'll say he ate meat, and he comes out in a way like they have this example of this story where he tried to show himself to be a fool in front of, these people who are his devotees. And in this way, we really see the same type of action that's done in Eastern holy fools. He may be doing things in an eccentric manner, but that doesn't mean that he's doing things for show or as a show of false pride. There's Eastern people who were said, to be frequenting brothels in order to Eastern saints who frequented brothels to kind of liberate women from those lifestyles. They would go to the brothel, they would just kind of hide in there, teach the catechism or something to the woman. The woman would just sit in there so that she would have wouldn't need to have any customers. So there's these things where people do some odd things, but it doesn't mean that they're doing things out of false pride. Then we should be saying that the holy fools had false pride. a false humility, and we wouldn't really. The Easterners probably wouldn't want us to say that about them. So we really need to take into account that there are these differences, and that things may not be exactly as they appear. And looking at a quote here and there or a story here and there may not give us the full picture. It may not give us the full picture of what's really going on. So that's kind of a thing there. So I'm going to try to finish this video by including a bunch more things, but I may make another video on this so that we can make it a little bit longer. But those are, I think maybe I'll leave it there because those are some specific criticisms of saints. And again, they say that our saints are experiencing these kind of flirtations, but yet our saints also experience great barrenness. And Saint Teresa of Avila, who's a friend of Saint John of the Cross, talked of the dark night of the soul. Saint Therese of Lisieux, far from experiencing consolation and sweetness without this truth, she experienced many ways in which she had to conquer herself, and talked about conquering her inclinations in various ways. Making sure that she was nice to those who she disliked. She always was fighting against herself. She also, rather than being in this, consolation place all the time, she actually had a deep sense of alienation from God at the end of her life. These are very real things. You and Mother Teresa, had this deep sense of disconnection from God. These are not the things. This is not the full picture. These things are a bad argument. And we have to remember that this argument about the Western saints is often made in response, and I originally read it in response to a claim asking, how do you know the Orthodox Church is the true church? And the claim was not approached in a direct manner. Instead, it said our saints essentially show humility, whereas Western saints don't. Your saints are in delusion and our saints are not. But but we have to realize that this type of argument proceeds as a kind of deflection from the actual answer. That's not really an answer to the question. It's just showing a contrast in spiritual style, which, as we've seen, seems to actually be proceeding from a bad reading and a bad understanding of the lives of these saints, as opposed to an actual problem that's there. So I'm going to leave this video here because there's some things that I really want to bring out some more details about this issue and make another video about that. But this is primarily responding to those specific accusations against saints like, Saint Francis, Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint Therese of Lisieux, and just simply looks at them as bad arguments that are, and this is a way of not addressing the arguments about the authority of Catholicism and its broader reasons for being the true church.